Anyway, my name's Diane Greer, and I'm chairing this session, working in the communities. And so it's obviously my role to kind of keep us to time, and we're a little bit kind of late getting started, and we'll be finished for 3:30 in order that the next panel can get going for 3:40. But just as a little introduction, I was delighted when Connal asked me to come up and chair this session. And when I seen the title, like others, kind of Paving the Path to Peace, it kind of made me think about a friend of mine who's a stonemason. That's the first person, that whole idea of paving the path. And he's a stonemason, and he loves his job. He's often having things. And he loves it, but he would say it's hard work, and you need to have strength and stamina. And he would often talk about the different types of work that he gets. And he says sometimes you get, you get to design, the path yourself. And he said, he brings to that his knowledge of his trade. He brings to it his skills, his understanding of the materials, and his knowledge of the lay of the land. He said, but sometimes, he said, he's given, it could be like an architect's drawing or a landscaper's drawing or something. And he said, they often know what they're talking about, but he said, sometimes he is left, he says, but sometimes he gets a drawing on a page, just somebody has freehand drawn, and he says, you're left to interpret and try to kind of pull something from it. And so I was really, when I read the title, I was thinking about that, and I thought, he would often say that, when he has control over it, he's often happier with the result. When he has to work to somebody else's brief, it can be frustrating. And he says, but often, he said, you go back to the drawing board with the client, and he said, and in there, he said, to collaborate and, creatively think together. And he says, and in there lies the drama and the reward. And I thought that was really kind of, may not make any sense to any of you, but it made perfect sense to me when I was thinking about the introduction to this session. So anyway, we have three fine panellists who between them have a wealth of experience. We have Eileen Weir from the Shankill Women's Centre, and I'm sure they're known to quite a number of you in the room, and Fr Martin Magill from St John's in Falls Road, and Jim McCusker, former trade union titan, I think I'd have to say. Anyway, Jim, not putting you under any pressure. So anyway, Fr Martin has to leave. I had you down to kick off, Eileen, but anyway, you're now closing the show. And
that's where I like to be.
Yeah, so I'll just do a little introduction to Fr Martin. Founder and I hope this is fair, but between you three...
Well, after listening to Titan, I'm very happy. I'm really interested in this.
When I was thinking about what I could pull out for a short introduction, you have so much, like somebody else earlier, there are reams of stuff I could talk about, but you're founder and joint chair of the Four Corners Festival, which sets out to inspire people from across Belfast to transform it for peace and prosperity for all. So it's kind of that's the mission there.
And there are other festivals as well available.
And you've been involved in loads across community initiatives, and you're very vocal about the need for us to learn from each other. You've across a whole load of things that you've done, and you're very passionate about our need to embrace new ideas, have new conversations, and to build positive relationships. And many of you, I know in April 2019. Fr Martin presided over the funeral of the young journalist Lyra McKee, who was shot dead in Derry, London Derry, where I'm from, by dissident Republicans. And you received that standing ovation. We're all probably very familiar with that, for a speech that many of us won't forget. When you commended the politicians for being there, but you very directly put it, whether that was your intention or not, but you put it up to them. Like, why had it taken the murder of this 29-year-old young, glorious woman to bring them to that point? And I think you spoke for so many of us at that time. It was a kind of a hold the breath moment when I watched the footage. And you call it as you see it. And I really like that. I mean, from afar, obviously, we don't know each other. And I don't stalk you, like, or anything, but I do know, like not in any way that would have me arrested, but anyway, but I do know about you, and you call it as you see it. And even in the last couple of days, you've been twittering away about the punishment beatings, and you're very vocal about that as well, like stop the attacks. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Connal, for the invitation to be here. And I just love the way you've actually sort of brought out that sense of the paving. And that sense of the title. I love the title, and I think that's probably why you got me involved in the first place, Civil Society and the Path to Peace. And this particular session this afternoon is working in communities. And just as I look around, it's very clear, as I certainly recognise very familiar faces here, that there are people very definitely working in communities. So I'm going to say a bit about stop attacks, because I think it gives me the opportunity to raise some other issues as well. It's a pressure group, and you mentioned social media, so we primarily exist in Twitter, to a much lesser extent in Instagram, and a little bit on YouTube as well. And we'll use, if there are opportunities in the mainstream media, to highlight the issues of what we refer to as ongoing human rights abuses. We will not use the phrase, I say with respect to you, that you just mentioned there, because we will see that as a form of victim shaming. But we will talk about it as human rights abuses, formerly referred to or sometimes referred to as paramilitary style attacks. And we want to refer to those because it's still an issue 25 years after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement. It has dogged our society, we believe, for decades, the abuse of other human beings, including children. And very interesting, I ended up on Talkback on Monday there with Chris Buckler, and I was actually finding myself almost wanting to defend mainstream media, and I don't often find myself wanting to defend mainstream media, but I almost did with Chris, because he was commenting that this is not an issue that gets very much coverage, and yet over the last number of years there have been a considerable number of media reports about it, and indeed good coverage from the Stephen Nolan Show, both his TV and radio programmes, as well as a Spotlight documentary, just again picking up some of the issues as well. And then recently Mark Simpson had picked it up, as well as Jude Hill and a number of other journalists as well. So there has been a greater focus on that over the past number of years for an issue which has really affected our society. So working in communities, I believe it's important that we need to tackle this. So in the past, it's not as if we're the only group to mention Families Against Intimidation and Terror, FAIT, which campaigned against paramilitary attacks. Set up in 1990 by a mother whose son had been shot by a paramilitary organisation. And that whole sense of, the passion that comes with people who are really convinced by a particular cause, and it takes a lot of courage to be able to speak out. And then there's also a sense of some of the people involved with the peace train and the peace movement, again, have been involved in that. I want to pay a particular credit to the tireless and meticulous work of Professor Liam Kennedy, founder member of a group called Children of the Troubles, which campaigns against attacks on young people by armed groups. He produced the first report on paramilitary attacks on children under 21 and young people under 21 with the title, They Shoot Children, Don't They? 2001. They shoot children, don't they? That's saying something. Very encouraged. I saw within the last year or so, Liam had, I think it was a letter or an article in the newsletter where he commented, or the title was, They Don't Shoot Children. And the reason for that is there has been a decrease in the number of shootings. Indeed, the last shooting of an under 18 was on July 2020. it's not something, well, from one point of view, yes, that's really good, but it's, even the very fact that I'm talking about this says something about the type of society that we are. We're a coalition of people, of youth workers, clergy, and faith leaders. So I'm including, and I see the leader of the Corrymeela community here, I'm including the likes of Shona Bell as a faith leader. I'm sure she'd be very happy to do that. And very good support from the Corrymeela community. As a small group, we've regularly gone to Corrymeela to look at where we are as a group. So our focus is to keep attention on the fact that these attacks, these human rights abuses, are still continuing. A little bit about the group itself. It came, I suppose, really from one of our members, Paul Smith. He's the CEO of a group called Politics in Action. And if any of you were at the last Tuesday at Queen's at the Good Friday Agreement events, Paul was very involved in a day which brought young people from all over Northern Ireland, and indeed also from the Republic as well, to Queen's. And Paul, a few years ago, was doing some research on paramilitary violence on young people, and he spoke to a number of people, including youth leaders. He also spoke to me during that time. His research got back to 2016. I'd known Paul from a previous parish. I was in Nativity Parish in Polglass, where Paul helped coordinate a youth group there. And in the course of his conversations, realised the value, and I think a number of us realised the value, and some of us who had a real concern and a heart for this ongoing issue, to come together as a coalition or as a lobby group, and we did so probably 2016 into 2017. We approached the leaders of the larger churches. I have to be very careful with my language. Some of the churches don't like the phrase mainstream or main churches, so I'm going to go for the larger churches. And they very poignantly and very powerfully spoke out on UN Universal Children's Day to highlight the ongoing abuse. And at the end of the day, you know, the definition of child abuse, it's very clear if you take a look at that, what was going on, what was happening to children was child abuse, and they spoke out very powerfully on that. We ourselves took to Twitter officially in January 2019. Our work has included meeting police, and I have to say now, at times we can be very critical of the police, and yet at the same time, I'm also very conscious as an organisation. So when we've talked to them about some of the press releases, they have listened. They've also been very generous with their time, and as a group, we're meeting the Chief Constable and a Senior Superintendent from the Paramilitary Crime Task Force next month to talk about the work of Stop Attacks as well. We've also met social workers and ministers from the Northern Ireland Executive. Now, there has been a decrease in recorded shootings and beatings, especially over the last few years. I'm not going to get too excited by that because these are inclined to fluctuate. Last year, for example, there were 33 of them, but there were 33 too many. We want to, as a group, be so successful we actually put ourselves out of business. I'm grateful for the support that we've had, and I see at least one member of the Department of Foreign Affairs, and I have to say, very grateful to the Department of Foreign Affairs for their support. As a group, we had a very useful meeting, and we've had a number of useful meetings with members of the media, and I'm then sort of saying now mainstream media has actually had a greater focus on this particular issue, and we welcome that. Now, so I'm saying from one point of view that there has been a decrease, and yet I'm looking at the figures for this year because we as a group monitor those security figures that come out from the police each month. And the figures this year, I have to say, well, if they're anything to go by, and January and February's are only available at this time, will indicate there's going to be an increase for this year if they keep going the way that they're actually going. There have been already 12 shootings stroke beatings. So it's something that we need to be concerned with, and wider civic society. I suppose that's the encouragement. We really want to encourage people to speak out. And I mentioned Shona Bell from Carabila. I still believe Shona Bell came up with the phrase that we regularly will use on our Twitter feed, which is to have the collective civic courage to speak out and act against these. So grateful to have this opportunity to speak here this afternoon. And just to sort of focus on it a little bit more, if we take a look at our troubles, we'll often think about sectarian violence. This is intra, not inter. This is intra-community violence. And I don't purposely set out to be controversial here, but how come we have tolerated this for so long? We've certainly put up with it for the last 25 years. I mean, but it can be, you can actually trace it back to the beginning of the Troubles, and for, in fact, of course, with Connal, you have a real interest in history. Go back even to the 1920s, I believe, and I think you will find examples there. So somewhere along the line, we've accepted this as a pressure group. We're going to keep working away to eradicate this completely. So in my opinion, the path to peace must include dealing with this issue of intra-community violence and how we figure out the best ways to do that. So part of it, I think, is continually raising the issue. And I'm very grateful that the Belfast Telegraph gave its front page story on Monday to the figures that a journalist, Alan Meban from the Telegraph, was able to find a freedom of information request to the police. And listen to the dates. He asked the police for a very extensive range of information from the 10th of April, 1998, and then it's this year. But again, I found the date that he chose. Now, obviously, it takes some time to do that, but the date that he asked for was to the 14th of February, 2023. There wasn't a lot of love over the last 25 years for the victims of those. And I'm going to share with you, if you haven't already heard the figures. So I had a phone call from Andrew one day last week, and I couldn't believe it. And I'm very familiar with this area of these human rights abuses. I couldn't believe it when he told me the figure. 3,259 assaults or shootings. 3,259 assaults. Civic society, I believe we need to waken up and do more than what we're doing at the moment. The youngest victim was 9. The oldest in his 70s. And 349 victims were under the age of 18. In other words, by law, children. So rather than me sort of just talk a little bit more in figures, let me give you some of the examples of the injuries. And I'm going to give you simply 3 examples that really stood out for me. And this is, I've left this directly from the spreadsheet which the police supplied Andrew. Suspected broken nose, cut requiring 5 stitches to nose, 6 stitches to inside upper lip, 3 stitches in small finger on right hand, which is also broken, and grazed to left side of head. The victim was male and aged 12. Bruising and swelling to right eye, cut above left eye, cut to head, swollen lip, bruising and scratches to stomach, chest, and back. The victim was female and aged 15. I could give many more examples. I'm going to give one final one. 5, let me say that again, 5 gunshot wounds to right leg, 2 gunshot wounds to left leg, 1 gunshot wound to right elbow. The victim was male, age 18, and shot 8 times. Surely, this must raise some major questions for us as a society. How are we tolerating these? And as I say, I want to credit the media for the fact over the past number of years there has been a greater focus on these. Thank you, Connal, for allowing me this opportunity to be able to raise these. But it's still an issue that we need to tackle. I suppose whenever I got involved in stop attacks 5 years ago, I saw as a very simple issue, but in fact it's much more complex, and it raises just so many societal issues. Now, just staying with the figures, and I'm going to stay with the figures from the Freedom of Information Act, because it really wants me to, I want to allow them to raise some other issues or wider issues within this whole question of paving the path to peace, working in communities. And it's to take a look at the postcodes, because the postcodes were also available to us as well. It's very clear these attacks happen in the less well-off areas. The affluent parts of Northern Ireland don't experience them in anywhere near the same sort of way. And indeed, some of the postcodes almost have none of the 3,259 cases which were recorded. But let me illustrate it with a couple of examples. So I'm working in St John's Parish, which is in West Belfast. The postcode is BT12. Now, I grew up on a small farm close to the international airport in the Aldergrove area. Its postcode is BT29. So I thought I'd take a look at the 2 postcodes, my home area and where I'm working. BT29, in the course of the last 25 years, had 1 of these attacks recorded. BT12 had 263 in the same period. BT29, BT12. So I think in some ways these figures and what's going on there give us some idea of issues that our society still needs to tackle if we want to progress on the path to peace. And that is the unequal sharing of resources. There's a wide gap, in my opinion, between those who are doing very well in our society and those, to use, and Diane mentioned Lyra McKee, and Lyra McKee would have talked about the working classes are really struggling. This is Lyra a few years ago. So I believe there's a lot more for wider society, including churches, including us in the faith sector, Alex, to be involved in tackling some of these issues. Now, I welcome the fact that I am seeing churches being more willing to work together. I'm aware, for example, that there's some churches are working on the issue of poverty and looking at what possible solutions or what ways can churches help alleviate some of the difficulties. But there are important lessons, I believe, as we look back on the last 25 years to those figures. As a society, it would seem to me the postcodes indicate that we really do need to tackle more head-on the issue of poverty. So, for example, I think the government at the minute will talk about, the Conservative government will talk about levelling up. I think we really need to see more of that, because what seems to be the case is paramilitary groupings have a stronghold or a grip in the poorer communities. And to really tackle the issue of poverty, I think, in my opinion, would help slacken that grip. I don't really need to go through some of the issues affecting, because we're probably all familiar with them. The likes of educational underachievement, low health outcomes, lack of opportunity, and very possibly also drug dealing, drug addiction, though of course that can affect right across our society. But the whole question of people not having agency, and I'm purposely using that word, a sense of the powerlessness, the fear. And Monica McWilliams, who's part of the Independent Reporting Commission, of course, obviously very much involved 25 years ago, but Monica McWilliams, I believe, has actually given us a very useful phrase, or has taken the phrase from domestic abuse, coercive control, that's that phrase, coercive control, to describe what's actually going on in some of those communities. But of course, it's a difficult and it's a complex relationship that some people will resort to those still involved in violence, to some of the armed groups, organised criminal gangs. So a real appeal this afternoon to us in wider civic society to tackle the inequalities, to lessen the grip of paramilitaries. And so how do we build communities where people will have the confidence to be able to speak out? And again, I just want to say a word of thanks to the Department of Foreign Affairs, to Nicholas Murphy, who's part of the support for the Independent Reporting Commission, for contacts that he's given me with a man called Dr. Rob Worrell, who's working on a number of projects looking at the whole question of leadership in certain places and how to build up that leadership, because I really do believe that it would make a difference to us here. So coming from a church, working in a parish community in West Belfast, which has seen and continues to see its share of conflict and societal issues, I want to put out to the churches, to people of faith, I'm going to include the Mennonites in that as well. There mightn't be too many here, and I'll not say this time that they punch above their weight. That wouldn't be fair. They wouldn't want me to use that sort of language. But no, honestly, for us in the faith community, what can we do to play our part in the public square and to become more involved in our local communities? And to recognize, and I say this to us in churches, have we at times been so concerned to stay within our walls that some in communities feel abandoned? I'm purposely using the word abandoned because I've heard that by churches, that we've become so focused on ourselves, and I say that to Catholic parishes as well, that we have neglected some of the other work. So the work of building peace, I believe, means we should be working closely with our communities to help people find the answers to some of the problems that they face. I'm going to share with you a paragraph or a short quotation from writer and broadcaster Jim Deeds. This article is going to be published in about, I think, hopefully in the next few weeks. And it's his challenge to people of faith within the Catholic community. And it's a really radical piece. Here he is. We might even think about how we can use churches and buildings differently in the future. Can we sustain a tight grip on our churches as worshipping spaces when we have so many already only partly full, and when so many people are in need of food, shelter, childcare, education, and refuge? What if, I wonder, Jim goes on, we convert some of our underused churches, church halls, parochial houses, into space for such projects of outreach? What if we divest ourselves of those scantily used buildings and the bills of maintenance and donate money to good causes and fund workers for this new model of church? So as I come towards the end of this piece, this weekend, for some of us in our church traditions, we're going to hear a line from John's Gospel, chapter 10, verse 10, which says, "I came that they may have life and have it to the full." As we look back on the last 25 years, we have to acknowledge the fact that there are some people who are not, because of their circumstances, living life to the full and enjoying some of the benefits that some of us have enjoyed over the last quarter of a century. So now that we've marked 25 years from the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, I believe it's time to focus on some of the unfinished work of peace. And to my mind, the best way to do so is for us as wider civic society to become involved in building the peace, in paving the peace. And that will include resolving those issues which are still holding us back, and in particular, those of human rights abuses.
Thank you very much, Father Martin. That gave us lots of food for thought and reminded me of my time working with Extern in the kind of early 90s. And at that time, the paramilitaries were putting youngsters out of the town. And we took them to Donegal and we held them, and then we tried to negotiate their way back in. But there weren't, the attacks hadn't accelerated to what you're describing. So that's definitely a massive issue. And of course it's linked to poverty and class and all of that.
Absolutely.
But yeah, so yeah, thank you. Okay, Jim McCusker, what about you now? Well, for anybody who doesn't know, Jim is a former trade union leader. And not any old trade union leader. This reference will mean something to some of us and nothing to others. He's an M&S trade union leader, ex-trade union leader. Anyway, I used that. The old, not any old gravy, it's M&S gravy. I used that with a group of young people recently, and they didn't get it at all. So I realised all my cultural references, or all my references are so dated. But anyway. Okay, but Jim, you would be credited with, in the day, like in 1971, when the NIPSA was formed, you grew the numbers and you grew the militancy, according to the sources at the time, and you kind of overseen the first ever all-out strike, which was about pay, and you were successful. And when I was kind of reading about you and kind of whatever, I was thinking today, like all the strikes today, and I'm sure you have stuff to say about that. But you took over as General Secretary in 1977 when Brenton Harkin resigned, and it was 1979 when you led that all-out strike. And you've been very involved with the Irish trade unions as well, serving as president there from 85, 86. And you've spent your life fighting pay and conditions for workers for a lifetime. And I know you retired in 2003, but you didn't retire. You chaired the Labour Relations Agency from 2008 to 2014, and you've been on a whole range of different committees, all kind of linked to your interest still in the economy and wages and workers, etc. So really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So over to you as well.
Thanks very much for the introduction. I'm not sure the members of NIPSA would always agree with how flattering your introduction has been. But I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak here and to Connal and the Department of Foreign Affairs for funding this exercise. As has been said, the Troubles were a dark period in the history of Northern Ireland, but occasionally there were light moments. In the late 60s, the belief of the Labour government was that part of the resolution of the Troubles was to create employment by a major programme of public works. One of the consequential problems of an increased scale of public works was you needed more civil engineers in the civil service to manage oversee the programme. In the civil service in those days, the scale for a civil engineer was over 10 points long. In order to attract more engineers in, the management side decided to offer new recruits salaries at the maximum of the scale. This resulted in people who had been to university together, with some coming into the civil service directly after university, and others going elsewhere and then being recruited into the civil service. They ended up working side by side, but those who entered the civil service immediately after university were towards the bottom of the pay scale, while the others were at the top. I wrote to the management side complaining about inequality. The management side secretary was a Christian evangelical, and in response he reminded me of the parable of the labourers in the vineyard, where those hired in the 11th hour were paid the same as those hired in the first hour. I consulted a member of the late Ian Paisley's congregation, who often sent letters to the press with biblical quotations. As I'd got him upgraded, he was very understanding, but he was unable to give me a suitable rejoinder. At the time, a little red book of the thoughts of Chairman Mao of the Chinese Communist Party was remarkably popular, and as he used to say, you could find it in all good bookshops. So I glibly wrote back to the management side, saying I didn't think the Bible was a good foundation for arbitrating on civil service pay, but possibly Chairman Mao's little red book would be more appropriate. The management side secretary wrote back to me saying, one of Chairman Mao's sayings reads, quote, "The workers of the state should be thankful for the rewards for their miserable efforts." Turning to the darker side of life, the experience of trade unions was that sectarianism manifested itself in many ways. People working in the public services were targeted individually and collectively at work and outside work. Members were threatened by paramilitaries from both sides solely for carrying out their public duties. Unfortunately, a number were murdered. For instance, a civil servant was murdered as he was carrying out Social Security benefit work, and others because they worked in prisons. Therefore, we had to be concerned not only about the safety of our members at work, but also outside of work. Of the collective threats, the most profiled were those to staff in Social Security offices, now renamed Jobs and Benefits offices. In response to paramilitary threats, staff walked out. While these walkouts attracted public support and led to the withdrawal of threats, sometimes after several days, management penalised staff by deductions from pay for absence from work. The management reaction was, to say the least, disappointing, because it was the staff, through their action, ensured the continued delivery of service to the public. To be fair to management, they didn't resort to the anti-trade union laws brought in by the Thatcher government. You will be familiar with the recent and current industrial action in public services, for which there has to be a ballot of members prescribed in complex detail in legislation. The question has been left hanging as to whether spontaneous walkouts by staff in reaction to sectarian threats is unlawful industrial action, for which trade unions can be penalised if we do not publicly disown it. While instances of sectarianism seem to have intensified during the Troubles, it has been latent in our society before and since. There's a strong link between sectarianism and inequality, in that sectarianism seeks to advantage one section of society over another. Although sectarianism may not be the sole source of inequality in Northern Ireland, it has been a significant contributor. The trade unions have long held the view that a society plagued by inequality is unstable. Two of the most important things in life are a job and a home. Hence, a society in which jobs and houses are provided on an unequal basis is not a stable one. As Tom Gillen mentioned this morning, as far back in 1966, the Northern Ireland Committee of the Irish Congress was a leading party in drawing up a memorandum on citizens' rights. The fair allocation of jobs and houses featured prominently in the memorandum, as did one man, one vote, and an ombudsman for complaints of maladministration by government. As Tom said, the memorandum was presented to the unionist government of the day, but was totally rejected by them. Subsequently, many of the elements of the memorandum were adopted by the civil rights movement, which developed along a political path. The trade unions took a different path. Through its affiliated unions, the Northern Ireland Committee represented over 200,000 people drawn from all sections of the community throughout Northern Ireland. As the largest organisation in civil society, the Northern Ireland Committee decided that the strength of the trade unions lay in the support it drew from across the community. In order not to jeopardise cross-community support, the trade unions pursued a path independent of any political party or group. The course followed comprised two elements. First, by embarking upon intensive campaigning and lobbying on key issues in the memorandum, such as jobs, housing and policing. And secondly, by showing that progress could be made without resort to violence and giving the wider community the opportunity to demonstrate to politicians that they supported the peaceful means of dealing with our difficulties. By the mid-70s, some progress had been made on jobs, housing and the Ombudsman. Through trade union input to a government working party, we had the first Fair Employment Act. For the first time in either the UK or the Republic, it outlawed discrimination in employment on grounds of religion or political belief. The 1976 Fair Employment Act was not perfect, so the trade unions continued to press for improvements. Our pressure, along with others in the community, resulted in two further acts in 1989 and 1998. The statistics show that this legislation is one of the success stories of Northern Ireland. In 1990, when we first started monitoring the religious composition of our workforce, the proportion of Catholics was 35%. In 2021, the Catholic proportion had risen to 50%, which is just 1% below the estimate of the proportion of Catholics available for work. Another measure of the success of the Fair Employment Acts is the number of claims of religious or political discrimination lodged with the Fair Employment Tribunal. In 2002, there were just under 500 claims of religious or political discrimination. But by 2021, the number had dropped to 81. To put it in a different perspective, in 2021, there were nearly 4 times more claims of sex discrimination as there were of religious discrimination, and 3 times as many claims of disability discrimination. It seems that religious discrimination in employment is no longer a top discrimination issue. Returning to the housing issue, in 1991, the trade unions realised a long-held aim of having one central body for social housing in Northern Ireland, with the creation of the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. It brought in an equitable system for allocation of social housing throughout Northern Ireland. Though the points-based system is not perfect, it's a vast improvement on the discriminatory way in which social housing had been allocated by local councils, depending on which political faction dominated each council. Another success of the Housing Executive was the supply of more social housing. Between 1976 and 1990, the Housing Executive built 80,000 new social housing units. That was an average of over 5,700 a year. With the Housing Executive now emasculated, there's a goal of building 2,000 new social houses a year. However, in recent years, a mere 800 a year have been provided in the face of growing homelessness. By the early 70s, not only was the Ombudsman set up, but the employment in the Northern Ireland Civil Service was brought within the ambit of the Ombudsman. This was a provision sought specifically by the trade unions and was unique to Northern Ireland because employment in the civil service was excluded from the scope of the Ombudsman and the rest of the UK. Earlier I mentioned the engagement of the wider community, and we sought this through lobbying for support for our campaigns and public lobbies. At the outset of the Troubles, the Northern Ireland Committee of Congress published a programme for peace and progress. 29 years before the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, it said, among other things, I quote, "Northern Ireland is constituted as an integral part of the United Kingdom, and that position can be changed only by democratic decision of the majority of people of Northern Ireland." Unquote. The programme went on to say that all citizens should be free to advocate change, but should reject the use of physical force as a means of achieving political objectives. It also called for the repeal of the draconian Special Powers Act, much envied by the apartheid regime in South Africa. One of the first rallies saw the launch in 1976 of the trade union's Better Life for All campaign, mentioned by Tom Gillen this morning. The campaign asserted 6 rights, the principal one being the right to live free from violence, sectarianism, intimidation, and discrimination. It called on individuals and organisations to cease all violence. The resolution, overwhelmingly passed at a rally, declared that peace was not just the absence of violence, but a society in which every citizen could play his or her part, free from sectarianism and economic and social disadvantage. In the face of continuing civil unrest and strife, in 1986, the trade unions published its platform for peace, work and progress. Significantly, it declared there was no acceptable level of violence and no legitimate targets. As part of this platform, young people were targeted, as Tony Mulligan mentioned this morning, by the Hands Off My Mate initiative, launched in 1998. In cooperation with youth centres, student organisations, it promoted the message of anti-sectarianism through training, talks and rock concerts. A number of prominent trade unionists were in the leadership of the Peace Train initiative. Although the Irish Congress was not directly involved in the initiative, we made representations on the need to keep the Belfast-Dublin rail line open. I remember one meeting we had with a direct rule minister on the risks to staff on the train and on the maintenance of the line. At that meeting, we had a train driver who was traumatised by the realisation that for several days he had driven over a non-detected bomb on the line. Without giving us the opportunity to put our case, the minister insisted on initiating the discussion by saying what concerned him was that when the army went in to search the undergrowth at the side of the railway lines, it disturbed the voles and the kestrels. That experience highlights the quality of governance under direct rule. One more initiative was the creation of an anti-intimidation unit called Counteract in 1990. The aim was to help workers experiencing sectarianism at work. It also drew up anti-sectarian guidelines for community organisations, and in 1995 produced a training video featuring an aspiring actor called Adrian Dunbar. Further rallies attended by thousands were held in the 90s. At rallies held in a number of towns throughout Northern Ireland in 1992, following the murders of workers at T-Ban, the trade unions once again made it clear that there were no legitimate targets. In the next year, the trade unions persuaded the employers to sign a joint declaration of protection for employees. The aim was to get employers and trade unions in each workplace to sign a declaration of commitment to the creation of a harmonious workplace by banishing discrimination, victimisation, intimidation and harassment. This initiative was renewed and expanded in 2017. Against the background of mounting tensions, atrocities, including the killings on the Shankill Road and at Grey Steel, and the controversial Hume Adams talks, the trade unions organised a community day in November 1993, which Tom Gillen mentioned this morning. Rallies were held in 14 cities and towns, with one estimate putting the overall attendance at 80,000, with an estimated 50,000 at Belfast City Hall. Community Day was followed up by a special phone-in petition in which 130,000 people declared that no cause justified the taking of human life and called for social and economic progress for everyone. Responding to the ceasefires in 1994, the trade unions drew up proposals for entitled Investing in Peace. A wide range of economic and social issues were covered, along with a renewed demand for a Bill of Rights specific to Northern Ireland. Significantly, the trade unions called upon paramilitary organisations and their political representatives wishing to be recognised in the political process then ongoing to commit to the sole and exclusive pursuit of their objectives by peaceful means. In the wake of the 1994 ceasefires, the European Union launched a key initiative. It set up a programme for peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland and the border counties of Ireland. In the first tranche of the programme, the trade unions argued successfully that the distribution of a major proportion of the funds should be decided by district partnerships in each district council. The partnerships were fully reflective of civil society, with representatives of local employers, trade unions, community organisations and farmers. At that time, there were 26 district councils, so it was an impressive exercise in engaging civil society at grassroots level. That delivery model stands in sharp contrast with the current method, where the limited funds which the Westminster government has promised in substitution for European funds are being allocated remotely by civil servants in Whitehall. Indeed, the current delivery model could be deemed contrary to the spirit of devolution implicit in the Good Friday Agreement. When the ceasefires of the Provisional IRA ended in 1996, the trade unions once again organised rallies at many locations in Northern Ireland. Tens of thousands were given the opportunity of voicing their support for the path of non-violence. After the renewal of the ceasefires in the provisional ceasefire in 1997, the trade unions revised their investment in peace proposals with an emphasis on major investment in combating sectarianism. Sectarianism and inequality, as I've mentioned, are linked. In some quarters, there may be a temptation to manage inequality by ensuring that each section of society is doled out its fair share of resources, including public funds. Such an approach is not a recipe for peace and prosperity. For a start, it is not inclusive because it excludes those who choose not to be labelled to belong to any particular section of society. More fundamentally, it intensifies divisions between sections of society and provides a fertile breeding ground for conflict and consequential instability. A society which is characterised by an equal but separate attitude is less likely to be conducive to the more egalitarian community to which we all aspire. Such benign apartheid is not compatible with the trade union goal of an inclusive society which sees value in diversity. In conclusion, I hope what I have outlined of the work of the trade unions during the Troubles shows that we trod a tightrope between strongly advocating equality in citizens' rights and avoiding party politics. We were subject to allegations that we were favouring one political line or another, but we were careful not to usurp the role of politicians. Through mass rallies, we aimed not to undermine or bypass political parties, but to demonstrate that there was space for political parties to enter dialogue with each other. Thank you.
Can I just say that because Father Martin had to go off at 2:45 and he was over his time, and maybe I should have taken a chance to ask if anybody had any questions and if he could stay a minute or two, but I didn't anyway, so sorry about that if you had any questions for him. But he's not hard to find. If it's really important, you'll find him. And Jim, the other thing that I discovered listening to you, I didn't even know we had voles here. Do we have voles here, really?
I'm not sure. And the imagination of that minister, we certainly did.
It certainly did. Well, I had a bit of a conflict there and standing up for the voles and the kestrels, but anyway. But thank you, Jim. Okay, our final speaker, and I think we're like nearly on time, Connal. Eileen Weir, and I'm going to kind of look at, I mean, much as I know you and know of your work, I'm going to look at my notes to keep myself from rambling. But I mean, you're obviously well known and respected, and an award-winning community development practitioner. But you've spent lots of years like helping to identify need in the community, and then to set about developing strategies to build the capacity of individuals and community by running all the various development programs. And you're currently employed at the Shankill Women's Centre. Oh no, that's right, you were telling me just before we came on.
I lost my funding.
Well, you're going to tell us something about that?
It's not just me, you know.
Yeah, I know. But you were working with the Shankill Women's Centre, and I know you're still kind of engaged. Yeah.
Not getting rid of me yet, like.
No, I know. As the coordinator of the Greater North Belfast Women's Network, which is a kind of good relations programme. And I know you're so well networked. I mean, if you say your name, people all over the place know you, and you've spent many years building and cultivating that network of across the island and beyond. And I know that, and lots of other people will know that as well. And I know in 2018 you won awards. You won the CRC Award for Exceptional Achievement. And then you won and I read this, when I was reading this, I read it. I thought it was the Jim McCusker Civil Rights Award, but actually it was the McCluskey Civil Rights Award for your role around human rights and civil rights and building community building activities. So Eileen, you have a long career doing this work. So we'd love to hear what you have to say about it.
Okay, I'm not going to go so much into the past, because I think we've spent 25 years talking about the past, and I want to thank Connal for inviting me here. I don't like this type of stuff. The hardest bit about this is sitting on the chair for this length of time, because I normally don't sit on a chair for this length of time. But you know, this morning's panels, all of them, I have to say, I connected with each one of them. Mm-hmm. You know, Avla Kamari was my women's officer.
Yeah.
So I connected there. Ulster People's College, that Bruna mentioned, I was part of taking women and part of their leadership program. Trade unionism, that's why I'm here today, is my role within trade unionism. I'm going through the equal opportunities, going through the fair employment, going through the flags and ambulance. I worked in Ballymena at the time of flags and ambulance, so you can guess what that was like, trying to get the men to take the flags off the machines. So my negotiation skills that I was taught by Fr Martin within the trade union movement has actually got me sitting on this seat today. So I'm not going to go back there, but I can talk about what I see over the years within Shankill Women's Centre. Our CEO, Betty Carlisle, knows the ins and outs and the workings. He tries to get the funding and tries to keep things all together. But it's been very visual over this last lot of months, last lot of years, to be honest with you, but it's getting to that crucial stage now at the minute of building good relations and peace building in communities that probably need it the most, because we work across North and West Belfast and beyond within the good relations, peace building and education. And, you know, a couple of years ago, our education team, because the women's centres are built around the education, because education has let people down, and in particular women, because women, when they were growing up, they didn't need to get a job. They were going to be the wife. They're going to look after the kids. They're going to look after the elderly. They're going to do, you know, the food, make the food, the dinner coming in. So there was no real education achievement within women as such, although they're still doing all those things. They seem to have been left behind very much so in society. Our education team, which is the core and the backbone of any women's centre, we went from 3 full-time staff and we have a 15-hour worker now trying to keep education going for women who our education system let them down. It wasn't their fault. I'm dyslexic, and it was only going through the Women's Centre that I realised that it's not an issue, it's not a barrier, but I was told all my life, you can't read, you can't spell, so you'll not be able to achieve. So I had to prove all lemons wrong, like that who said that, who growing up, and it was a very hard life for me because I was a convener in the trade union movement, and the agreements that factories have, in particular the factory that I worked in, there was agreements coming out of your ears, so where other people would read agreements, I would read the agreement 10, 15 times and then memorise it. So I had a memory that I had to use to fall back on. But the women's sector at the minute, we're buckled. We're on our knees. And there's no other way to say that as far as funding. And our big cut's going to come in June. That 15-hour part-time education worker may not even be there. And that's letting our society down again. We have already been let down by society, and these areas are the low rates of maintaining, of education levels, in particular the Greater Shankill area where you heard Jackie Redpath talk earlier. The peace building and the good relations stuff, and I know out there's a big demand for, because the money's getting shorter, new groups are growing up, some funders have to drop two to bring two in. Instead of keeping what works and work on what works, it doesn't matter whether it's working or not. That doesn't mean to say you're going to get any funding. And in my case, that's what happened to me. So Friday the 31st of March, I lost my funding for my good relations and peace building work within the community. So did Falls Women's Centre. So did a lot of other community organisations, our rural in particular. Speaking to Charmaine earlier, and she just was pointing out that there's one worker being paid their wages by 3 funders. Do you know how much work that takes that worker to do? Now you're in that business.
I just take account.
You're in that business. So 3 different financial systems, 3 different reports, and 3 different ways of working. Now, if somebody tells me that's value for money, I don't believe it. I'm sick of talking about funding and funding and funding. And the more I seen last week in Queen's, the more and more I feel that we need to change the course of the way community is looked at. Because when you look at community, you look at 25 years of people building peace and good relations and building friendships and building trust among all community. A few politicians are saying our communities are broken, are divided, but there's more internal division than what there is across the communities. I've done a number of programs where I've asked the women, what's the difference now to before the Good Friday Agreement? And the answer that I get back, we fear our own more now than we fear the other. And that's sad. So, I don't like using cross-community for those reasons, because it's women from across all communities. Good Friday Agreement and the Fair Employment Act, it's actually on the news the other night. We need to look at that, because we have people have came here, settled here from different countries, who actually need to be brought in. Because if we have to share, we need to share with everybody. We can't leave nobody behind, and every voice has to be heard. And that means not everything stops and ends in Belfast. It's a province-wide thing, and there's a lot of stuff in front of us at the minute, but do we have the resources to deal with it? The Windsor Framework is the next thing that we're expected to get out to the communities. I have to say, and I have to thank again, the Department of Foreign Affairs is going to get a big head out of every time they've been mentioned, but I have to say that they have invested probably more than other well, the UK government has in our peace building and good relations process. And, you know, without them, I don't think we would be where we're at today. But it's more about a distant government in Westminster not knowing how crucial it is for these areas who have been let down by the Good Friday Agreement. You know, I mean, I want the Good Friday Agreement implemented, and I think the first thing they should do when they get back is set up a committee to look at the implementation of the Good Friday Agreement outside of the normal politics. That needs to be set up. And the other thing that I would like to see is the word investment used. Because we have a fantastic tourism trade here. They wouldn't have that if we hadn't been doing our job for 25 years on the ground. We have kept peace here. We have kept communities stable. And our tourism has risen, quite rightly so. But what are we benefiting out of that? Nothing. If we hadn't been doing the work that we have been doing, we wouldn't have that industry. That's making profits. And that profits go where? Let that profits go into the people who actually got them their profits in the first place, which is, let's share it. Let's share what the 25 years have done. And civic society have done an awful lot more than our politicians over the last 25 years to maintain peace. And COVID was another thing that put our peace process back 5 years. But the women's sectors, the women's movement, the women's organisations rallied round and done the food banks, rallied round and done the caring, rallied round to get the doctor's prescriptions, rallied round to school their children in the house. But everything else stopped. Our young people weren't meeting up with groups from other communities. Our older people weren't getting together, and isolation became a bigger problem. So we, coming out of COVID, put us back about 5 years, not to count the 2 years that COVID actually hit us. And again, it's the unpaid work that's being done by women across all communities. I'm not just talking about women's centres. So we need, big businesses are coming here. You know, I think it should be part of the deal of the Windsor House framework, is that if a big industry comes here to settle up, they have to take a charity organisation under their wing and fund them and be part of that. Be part of, when does anything ever come in when big businesses, and it's all business people, all men, all sitting around the table, looking to see how much they can get and the much profits that they can get without actually having a clause in it that you have to share your profits. Pick a group, pick a community group, pick an organisation, and you fund that. Sorry, you invest in that. Because the only way that we're going to get our communities out of where they are at the minute is by investment, not by funding. Year-to-year funding's no good. We're not getting younger people through. We need younger people to take on the roles that I have been doing for the last, I tried to count them when you're up there, so that's, you know, I mean, I think I'm doing this 30, 58 years, 40, you know, I'm trying to, 43 years, you know, and, you know, my fight's still the same today as what it was all those years ago. Childcare, education, health system. My fight hasn't changed here at all. And to get a voice, to get civic society, to actually be listened to. And again, May was a very good friend of mine. And it was May's name of her book, Watch My Lips, I'm Speaking. You know, we need to be saying, yes, but they need to listen to what we're saying. 1325, European or UN Resolution 1325. It's a disgrace that Northern Ireland doesn't actually, you know, recognise that. But yet we have a 1325 committee up in Stormont. You know, the Southern government actually has included the women from the North into their 1325 document. Again, this is through Department of Foreign Affairs once again. So I think they need to look seriously, because we are buckled, we are crippled, and we can't take no more at community level. I'm at the minute, I'm lucky enough that I'm getting a wee bit of money in because I've moved from I used to do finance a number of years ago in between working up in the women's prison. I used to do finance, and our finance worker left last week, and I was asked to come in and do a few hours in finance just to keep the finance going. And it's given me a wee bit of headspace, but it's given me too much headspace because I'm thinking, when Good Friday Agreement came out, everybody was excited. I was excited too because we rallied people around. We done education programs on the Good Friday Agreement. We done workshops on the Good Friday Agreement. We done everything, which I would like to do the same with the Windsor Framework. But those are the things that information, in particular in communities that has been affected the most, that they need educated in the wording of what's happening. And I have to say, we got an easy read, Windsor Framework, because we need things at community level broke down to everyday language, because that's the women and that's the community, young people as well. We need to involve them in our politics of today, not of 40 years ago, 50 years ago. We need to involve our young people in our politics of today and bring them on board. But the women that I work with, I am who I am because of the women. It's them that inspire me to do what I do. And I probably inspire some of them as well, but they inspire me. And it's an age group from about 40 plus that seems to be wanting to get wiped off the face of the earth, because that's the old ones. That's the ones who no longer count. We want to focus all on our young people, but see if we don't have that two-strand approach, because the older generation are the generations that passing down the trauma to our young people. And if we don't continue working with the older people who lived through it, who lost their teenage years, who lost, families, because families then were mixed families, believe it or believe it not. I grew up, my mother's sister married a Catholic, and I grew up playing in Ballymurphy, and then when the Troubles started, you weren't allowed to play in Ballymurphy anymore. So families were divided. So our whole way of life was divided. I didn't get the opportunity to sneak into the bar underage, for a drink, because my teenage years, not that I wasn't in many as I should been, because I was in many as I should been with you too. And again, that's just the way we lived. And my goal is that nobody has to live the life that I lived. Nobody. And just to say, to give us something, enough's not enough. I want more than enough. I want to be able to say, I have enough to go on holiday. I have enough to spoil my children. I have enough to do that. Not that I'm out working and I get enough to pay my bills. Enough's not enough.
Okay. Eileen, thank you very much. Thank you. And again, that kind of, we have 5 minutes. And I suppose that a lot of what you were talking about there, now given, the wealth of experience that is around all those women's organisations, etc., a lot of the organisations who lost their funding recently, and the trajectory, without getting totally depressed about it, the trajectory globally and internationally and nationally is kind of almost feels like a race to the bottom. And the idea that, maybe this is me, the systems don't seem to be working or serving people well. Like when you were talking about the Women's Centre, just very briefly, like 100 of us in Derry many years ago, we started the first Women's Centre by, we didn't have very much money, but 100 of us put £3 a month into a bank account. And we were called the Women's Centre Renters, aye. But anyway, and we got it up and running. It wouldn't even buy the milk for the creche like nowadays. And they've had they've slaughtered recently as well. And then you kind of made me think about, just that. And my generation, we campaigned for affordable, accessible childcare. We campaigned for lots of, and I worked for the WEA as well, and we had a Workers' Educational Association. We had a wonderful women's education project. And we did everything from the early self-esteem courses to the, assertiveness courses, then, women and conflict resolution, women in public bodies, women in public life. And it would, and then say the WA no longer exists, and various people today have, the threads I think running through are like poverty, even though we're talking about paving the path to peace, but all those things, like lots of things are kind of interlinked. And it sounds like some of the stuff that we need to really be investing in and thinking more strategically and long term about. It's not happening. It's just not happening for whatever reason. And people living, as Father Martin talking about, people living in communities where, as he says, paramilitary beatings are continuing, where people are still having control, where other people are still afraid. And of course, if you're living in a community where people still have guns, it's harder to speak up, it's harder to be vocal. And it's almost like a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, we're in our own, if you're a woman's sector, you're talking about that, if you're whatever, and I know people are talking across, but it's quite a depressing, and considering that we know there's a link to disadvantage and under educational, I wanted to ask Jackie earlier, like the underachievement of Protestant working class boys is almost criminal. And people are talking about this for 10 or 15 years. I remember talking to Augustus Spence in the day about it. And it hasn't got any better. So what's the problem? Like, what is the problem? Because while that continues to be the issue, we will continue to have the same outcomes. And it's sad, it's very sad. And I know there's like loads of great stuff in the cracks in between. We can't lose sight of that. Wonderful achievements, wonderful people, and people who we're going to lose, if we don't find ways to kind of sustain the best of what we do that has the best chance of working. But anyway, sorry about that. I went on. So a question up here.
My name is Peter Castles, and I've come here today from Dublin, and I want to ask Jim McCusker a question on the Belfast Good Friday Agreement. You're going to say I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Did the unions welcome the Good Friday Agreement, and you stressed the need for civic organisations and unions to go on that narrow path and not cross over into the political parties' vein. So did you recommend that your members vote in favour of the agreement, or did you have to stay out of that debate?
It varied. Some unions advocated support for the Good Friday Agreement. My union stayed neutral on the basis that the constitutional issues were involved, both the issue of the amendment to the Republic's constitution and the question of the status of Northern Ireland. So my union was neutral, but other unions campaigned for it. Whether those who did advocate yes were crossing the line was a debatable point in some of the unions. But I mean, given that it has passed, I think the problem now is that the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was top-down. We need a bottom-up approach from communities and dealing with the problem of sectarianism hasn't gone away. It's there, as some of the speakers earlier on have said. One of my personal disappointments is I mentioned the joint declaration with the employers, that more wasn't done with that, because when you enter a workplace, particularly in your early years, you form friendships, and if it's a mixed workplace, they're quite often across the divide, and I think we could do more by building on that. As I think Tom said this morning, traditionally the attitude was that the workplace should be neutral and you should leave your politics outside the door, a sort of non-sectarian approach. But Terry Carn in particular said, no, we have to be anti-sectarian. And that requires a more positive approach. It's difficult in the workplace, but it's something which I think has to be tackled. And I think there's a contribution to be made there as that part of civil society about building on relationships which develop in the workplace and which can be built upon to create a fairer society.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Thanks very much, Neil McCann. And Eileen, great to see you. We were on the residential last year. I think it was last year. With many others in Corrymeela. So the question is, in the context of civic society, and that there seems to be no appetite among the powers that be to actually get that aspect of the Belfast GFA agreement in place. But if there's no impediment to citizens ourselves organising that and getting funding, is that something that both in the trade union sector and the community workers and communities, is that considered realistic, is the question?
What is the question?
The question was, the politicians don't seem so so keen to get the civil society. Can we do it ourselves?
Well, you know, information's power. And the less information that we can get out onto the ground, the more power that the politicians have. Really, that's been my experience. When you actually, I'll give you an example of information changing something. Part of my work a few years back, post-Brexit, pre-Brexit, I done a conference. And I brought Conor Houston in, who had a toolkit on Brexit. And we done an electronic vote on the way in. It was done in Garwood. I had over 100 women in the room. And we done an electronic vote on the way in. Stay or leave, right? Remain, all right. And I'm rounding these figures up. It was 70-30 to leave the European market. We done the toolkit. We give people information. We had a panel of women, some to remain, some to leave. And we spent about an hour and a half going through all this. Conor took questions and everything else. Then we done workshops around the table. And then we done an electronic vote again, after giving them all the information. And it flipped 70-30 the other way, 70 to remain. And it was the difference coming in. And that's the difference at information and the proper information. It's not my job to repeat anything that I hear on the media. It's my job to go and find out what's actually being said and not what I'm hearing on social media or even on the TV. I go and check the information and then I bring it back to the women. We had a conference last week on the New Ireland Commission that's being set up by mainly SDLP, and that just happens to be Conor Houston. So Conor tapped into me right away. And I was telling him a whole lot of things, and he was going, what? Bad language, Conor. Can't use that language, can't do that. And Conor's going, I says, look, I tell you what, I'll put you in a room of 50 women. You give your presentation, and then you take the feedback from them people. And he just went, right? And he done it. Fair play to him. I threw him to the wolves. He was there, and he done it And I said to him afterwards, he says to me, I'm not apologising for throwing you to the wolves. He says, no, well, I loved all that night, but my presentation has to change a quarter bit. And that's how, if you don't involve civic society, then you're going to put a presentation out there that will not, it'll ignore them. If their voices are not part of it, then they'll not feel part of it. And it's about bringing civic society with you to be part of what's going on, not to be on the other side of what's going on. So information, it can be done, it can be achieved, but you have to make sure that the resources are going to the right places and the right people are delivering those programs. Somebody said to me, peacemakers are not being funded, but peace breakers are. And
Yeah.
I just comment on the question, because I think there is a resentment among politicians, particularly after a long period of direct rule. They saw some people in civil society, trade unions, employers, as being in a privileged position of talking directly to direct rule ministers, serving on quangos and all the rest of it, and they resented that. And also they seem to have a fear of participative democracy. As I mentioned, we are all in the unions were careful to say we weren't there to usurp the role of the politicians, but to create the space in which they could move forward. And I think one of the problems of the Civic Forum was the way it was fleshed out, because politicians were put on it. Now, I served on the European Economic and Social Committee for 10 years. And it is made up of civil society, 3 sections. One's the employers, the other's the trade unions, and the third's community and farming interests. But there were very strict rules about that, in that if you were a member of any legislative assembly, you were not allowed to be a member of the European Economic and Social Committee. And it gave advice to the European Parliament and the European Commission. That was advice which they were free to accept or reject. And it's that idea of participative democracy. But I also suspect it's a problem not just for some of our politicians, but when the Eastern European countries came into the European Union, their concept of participative democracy was not what we in the western part of Europe understand. And there's still difficulties with that. I mean, there's problems with Hungary and to some extent Poland in trying to ensure that the judiciary is separate from the executive. And this is part of society, that there needs to be a division of how you organize governance. So it is a problem which some politicians have, not only in this part of the world, but in certain parts of Europe also.
Okay. Connal, I think that's us. So listen, thank you very much, and thank you both very much. And yeah.